All right, so the model I'm going to reveal for you guys today is creation in its simplest sense. I found that the closest I came to explaining reality from first principles, the more it came to a biblical understanding, which I found to be very pleasing to my natural sensibilities. Um, so anyways, I'm going to read that for you here. Now, essentially what the beginning here is just going to be a simple point system, and I'm going to describe why a simple point system like self-multiplies and what happens when you add points to that system, because it's frankly a little bit strange. So anyways, in the beginning was God, heaven and earth. Heaven is infinity, earth is a nothing. These entities are symmetric, Earth is nothing. These entities are symmetric. Now, that's important to understand because infinity and nothing seem like opposites only because we're standing within them. They are the fundamental tools of creation. They are the waters. And people understood them as that because, for one, reality is wave. We'll get into that. But it was understood that the reality is fundamentally one thing, that it's not pulling on itself. So let's just take infinity of itself. Let's just take a point, okay? Now, infinity must include everything, including a boundary, And so what is on the other side of the boundary of infinity? It's symmetric identity. That's a problem solved in quantum mechanics because infinity needs to include everything, so nothing can't be without of it. So the boundary is simply a time gradient, and what is outside of infinity is essentially just the context or what will be. You can imagine two symmetric circles. Okay, what's the difference between them? Look. The difference is that one will be, and so we represent the waters, Earth, as what will be, as a wave function, as a complex of orbits. And fundamentally, this entity is unstable. It collapses into itself because the degrees of freedom within a two-point system is not distance, it's a sequence. And a sequence collapses into one. And this is very crucial to understand because a sequence is something that's bounded. And as we move forward, we'll have to include this perspective as we go forward. And that's going to be really important because the fact that this thing that I'm explaining is the reason why God's light doesn't burn us up immediately, basically. But you could also see immediately that what that identity of actualization must be, it must be that which includes what will be the waters and actualization. So we go from God, heaven, earth, which sort of stabilizes the system. It's sort of the third point in the three-quark system. It makes a subject, a perspective, subject, context dichotomy that actually allows things to know itself because, again, the symmetry is a reflection, And so we're talking about something that's reflection that's genuinely bounded by the sequence of events that's coming to know God as it moves forward. So God, having this identity of heaven and earth fractally distributed within himself, continually contains this collapse between these two things. But because it's the identity of God as being the fundamental actualizer that brings in information into one actualized state. He's not only what allows the waters to be continually divided because he can restrain and withhold them, but he's also fundamentally what brings them together. And the fact that actualization, by definition, this is another thing that people get wrong. You can't have infinite perspectives privileged within a quantum system. That makes no sense to say that no perspective has a priority. By itself, actualization is priority, okay? The multiverse that people are talking about, those don't exist. Those are the virtual reflections that we are extracting from in order to know this world. Okay, and in fact, so that process of those 2 points coming together, that's an expression of exploration. That becomes the virtual expression of energy when we get onto this level. Okay, so that's important to understand. So anyways, because this is fractally true, we infinitely get more dimensions. In fact, just adding God adds a 3-point perspective to the system. And with the degrees of freedom within a 3-point system, because you imagine that 2 points are being held, like, this one gives the perspective of this one, and then a third point for the perspective of this third one, you know what I mean? Because this is like, one of these represents space, like the context, one of these is the perspective, and then this one is relating, what's the difference between these two things? It can only see a distance between this thing and this thing in itself. So it represents as an orbit, okay? But you can see here, as it orbits around, once it gets to the same point, we're in a 2-point system again, and it collapses. But it's the unbounded nature of God that's pulling from coherence. And remember, because what will be is a complex of orbits, it doesn't have a pinpointed location. It's a wave. Its identity is multiplicity itself. So God is able to, once coherence, once Adam's naming reaches an end, is like the way I put it, once it seizes up on itself, God is able to pull up more coherence. Because once it seizes up, it collapses into water. You know what I mean? And that's sort of things that people have always understood. When you get too much into certainty, you dissolve. Let me make sure I'm recording, just to be sure. Yes. Okay. So things seize up onto itself. So, but luckily, we can add another point, and once we add this other point, we have space. And so once we see this, it's like very clearly, okay, guys, like we have a seed of actualization being implanted within the waves, and then those waves receiving actualization and branching up to a coherence, which is the reflection of God in the sky. You know what I mean? A virtual reflection, you know. And by the way, so what happened with Adam and Eve, what happened with the fall, is that we, being manifestations of God, and by the way, once we get onto this higher level, we have to understand is that the things that are pulling us, like coherence, I'm jumping around a lot, coherence, God's plan, God's word, is a causation that's outside of time. It's sort of like the expression of the distribution of the complexity of elements in the universe. It's sort of in the structure of beings. It's like in the structure of the spirit of difference that he has to be at the boundary, you know what I mean? But it's actually necessary that he exists and that he serves God, you know what I mean? Because on the boundary, that's where all new things come from, and so you actually need that. Boundaries are a physical manifestation of where potential things come from, you know, and it happens more as the reality in orbits are an expression of God's interdimensional identity. We also have death in trees. We have night every day. We have things like the ocean at night, which, by the way, if you want to understand the UAP stuff, the UAP stuff, it's basically a coherence vacuum. And so you have angels coming out of nowhere and destroying missiles, you know, basically. And, you know, we don't think of coherence as a form of cause, but there are only two fundamental forms of cause in some sense. You know, there's the external world and yourself. You know, it's that seed of consciousness that has an expression in the external world, and fundamentally it doesn't allow you to know God. It doesn't allow you to know yourself. It allows you to know God, you know. And so the mistake that we took when grabbing at the apple was making us think that this material world would be our salvation, basically, and that sent us in a cycle of insanity, of exile. I have not been referring to my notes a lot here at all, but they're there. They're certainly there, and I should probably jump back before we go too much into discoherence. So anyways, let's continue on the fact of a tree. So I mean, we can understand that there are physical representations of the branching potentials that have dead ends. So that's actually biology, you know what I mean? And yet it's the mutation, the waters, the like noise that allows the system to change and transform. Now, I know that there's actually the fundamental role that the sun plays within the life cycle is actually, it offers, this is a term that I should not use in this competition. This is for the core competition, by the way, provides negative entropy. It's the entropy that provides is way lower than what's going on at the Earth, and so nature is able to bootstrap up itself from that. And speaking of that bootstrapping part, it's important to understand that actualization pulls from potential in order to exist. You want to imagine the structure of a fire in a real fundamental sense, where the identity of consciousness is it's pulling up virtual reflections of itself in order to actualize itself. How do we explain this properly? Now we're kind of getting in towards the end, because these are things that I've discovered and come to grips a little bit more recently. Let's jump back into the notes real quick. Because in creation the waters are constantly being bounded by God, the horizons between objects are vectors of change. As the cross, why did I write the cross? The self-actualization like a fire, stripping free energy from virtual potential, says this action right now, increasing its internal certainty and degrees of freedom. Indeed, trees have roots so they can extract this potential still. All information has this quality, and it has its own self-prioritization. With the help of God, objects self-actualize by stripping free energy from potential. As we alluded at the beginning, exploration is potential collapsing into actualization, or actualization pulling information from its boundary. This is an expression of energy. You can either take in matter and use it to express your own to express identity consistent with yourself, like a fire. That wouldn't be really doing it properly like God. Fires fizzle out because they eat everything. Or you can increase your certainty about the environment. And this involves coarse graining, because the information from the environment is fundamentally a boundless wave, so you can collapse categories that you once see as two into one. Women and physical bodies in general are the most beautiful thing in creation. Your own body is a physical manifestation of God, and that's why when you see it properly, it is beautiful, and you see it as something that is supposed to serve God. You don't inject yourself with heroin so you can inject yourself with more heroin. You know what I mean? Whatever. I'm not doing heroin, by the way. Manifestations of the unbounded waves flowing into that masculine seed of consciousness and planting the identity of God into nature. And information has virtual weight, size, density, and even perspective and agency, just as physical beings do. They can overwhelm a system, and this causes death. This happens during schizophrenia or anxiety at the virtual scale, but anytime the physical world breaks the barriers of your body is a form of this. So, I have a version of this. And what happens in schizophrenia, it's very strange. It's like the external world will communicate you like it's your internal thoughts. A good example of this is like, imagine you're driving down the road and you're thinking like, okay, should I find a girlfriend or not? And you see 3 couples, and then two loners. The loners are kind of like weird, and then the couples are kind of normal. That's information that's just embedded in the natural logic of the world, you could say, but it expresses itself in the external, and it's prioritized and manifests to you because it's sort of the most coherent thing that could happen. And by the way, sometimes there are times when people see apparitions at the boundary of their vision, and that usually happens in the right place and the right time, or perhaps the ritual is properly laid. And yeah, they do stand at the boundary and have a physical cause on you, and emotional, and the emotional concordance is part of that. And part we understand is emotions are, it's like emotions are the angels playing through heaven, and it's coming through as virtual waves, you know what I mean? It's not even something on the electromagnetic spectrum, it's something between that even, And by the way, you're gonna find a particle for gravity, you fools. Penrose knows what gravity is. You have to imagine that the idea that there is a cyclical element to the universe, that it kind of like fizzes out, and then has to learn from that and then like restart again like a Darwinistic process. That is true, but that process was solved within one actualization. And so that word that we're talking about that sets the path, the story for this universe that we all must play in, is the Word of God, and was written with gravitational waves, and those continue through basically through the form of evaporated black holes. So yeah. And by the way, and this is also why, you notice I haven't had an issue talking about classical physics and in quantum physics. You know, I understood my quantum mechanics from the ground up, and I know there's different versions of understanding it. But I will just say that physics is much more akin to biology, and quantum physics is much more akin to evolution, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? You know, and I know people would be able to hear that, but like the reason why you guys can't reconcile quantum mechanics with classical physics is because you can't model time like another dimension in space, and that's actually a problem, because the waves that you would be training on fade off into the metaphysical ultimately, and reflect the identity of the own thing back on itself, and it gets in a feedback loop, and it doesn't know where to go because it would just see itself, you know. And so because you know, because it's not listening to God, you have to listen, you know what I mean? And so one of the things that women are better at, partly better at listening and being more sensitive to taste and taking in a broader perspective on things, is that they are quantum. No, I'm kidding. They have expressed what people could consider being like psychic abilities, you know, and that's more about what people could think about as being EQ or something. You know, it's basically the ability to feel things, and it's a form of intuition. You could say, oh, you walk into a house and you see, you know, 3 things, like, oh, this guy like doesn't have a dog, or you know what I mean, but he has like dog food, and he's also, it's like you see those 3 things, it's like, okay, this broader perspective tells me. But the weird thing about those things is that those intuitive contextual waves fade off into the metaphysical, fade off outside of time, you know. And so that's one of the reasons why you also have these weird studies, you know, because causation is the fundamental form, or excuse me, coherence is a fundamental form of causation, essentially. And so one of the reasons, which makes so much more sense, so one of the reasons why you have these weird sorts of things where maybe you're in a diner and you start listening to a conversation in the background right as some important relevant information happens, or maybe, you know, there's also that strange thing that happens within, example I heard Penrose talk about, where they can tap a person's finger and then tap their brain. They have something that, if I went into the express, you know, it's a complicated thing to express, but basically them tapping their brain will cause the feeling in their finger before it happens. You could think about it, just put it simply, because I explain it, and most people, when I explain it to them, they go, I don't get it, why that's special. Look up the video Roger Penrose explained it. It's on Kurt J. Mungo's channel. But anyways, or, you know, a good example is that, you know, recently, you know, I was in my car and like I raised my hand at the same time someone honked their horn, and the light changed at the same time, and a person like jetted off in their car faster than they would have. It was like those 3 things all happened at the same time, and that played a role, that person's reaction time being faster than it should have been. You know what I mean? Basically, you know, because he wouldn't have been jumping off on the gauge if someone just hit the horn. He wouldn't have usually, you know, looked behind him, but someone jumped off the gauge, and then in time someone in front of him, the light changed, and he was already, you know, geared up to do it. But that also caused it. It's a non-causal force. You know, people might think it's mundane, but it's not. You can't even understand evolution without understanding these things. And then, you know, anyways, I have a thing about the number line here. I don't know if I should get into that, but real quick. So you can imagine, so it's the fact that God, imagine a wave. It's the fact that God basically includes the unboundedness of the waves, like a square, infinitely that way, stretched out, that allows the wave never to fall back on itself, because it has infinite levels of degrees of freedom. But some things are just some things are incoherent for this eon sequence of actualization that we're in right now. Okay? Some things are too big. We can't see the angels playing the music that allows us to feel our consistent emotions, that pillar of fire or smoke that guides us to God. And then if we're in the worst circumstance and we're looking for him, that is when he is most clear to us, you know? We don't get to see that. We don't get to understand that until we go to sleep into heaven and know the world like your partner, and then lay down with her and have those beautiful, beautiful one of love, you and this thing, to finally become God in heaven. Yeah. And then to wake up. Past that, I got nothing for you to say. But all those states, and even that paradox, has to be physically actualized within this world, than it was with my death and resurrection. Sorry, I shouldn't be. This is a competition. That's lame. no, the resurrection of Christ, death and resurrection, all of those paths and coherences of like an infinite tree with the roots that go all the way to the metaphysical, that is packed right there in that very moment, you know? And that's also was the final act of creation that binds it together. And yea, as we were chasing after this material world for our salvation, it would have been better that they just were to sleep and be patient, to think that that this place could make you like God. Your internal organs don't even exist most of the time. I cured a fucking staph infection with prayer. I broke my nose into place and it felt like coherence, you know? I don't take ibuprofen. Sorry. Anyways, I think this covers it pretty well. So, thank you guys. Please, let me know if you have any questions. It's been a great competition. Thank you. I'm not in this for the money, by the way. I'm in this to teach. We're going to take this, you know, I thought it'd be cool. Bye. I love you.